Thank you for joining me for this video related to Chapter 3 on consumer behavior in the hospitality industry. We'll be discussing the topics that are listed here, including factors that influence consumer behavior, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, purchasing decisions, the adoption process, and the consumer decision-making model. Along with that, also the FCB grid. As your text notes, there are both external and internal factors that can influence consumer behavior. The external ones include a lot of the topics that we've discussed earlier in Chapter 2. The culture, socioeconomic level, reference groups that you pay attention to, your household characteristics, and so forth. The internal influences we'll be spending a little more time on in this chapter. We'll talk about personal motives, the experience, personality, and self-image, and then perceptions and attitudes. One of the internal motives noted earlier was that of the needs of individuals. One of the most referred to models of this includes Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy of needs, the original base model, has 5 levels of needs. We start with the most basic level, the physiological needs for food, water, shelter, things of that nature. The second level up is safety needs, security for yourself, for your employment, your resources. That includes morality, your family, and a variety of other things. The third level, if you have attained both physiological and safety needs, then we move on to love, belongingness needs. This is also called social needs by some people. Friendship, family, intimacy with individuals. This level is only really a focus if you've achieved the first 2. If you achieve the first 3, then you move on to level 4, which is esteem needs. The self-esteem of the individual, their own confidence, the achievements that they have, respect that they get from others, and respect that they give to others. And finally, the top level is self-actualization. The focus on creativity, on problem solving, a lack of prejudice, acceptance of facts. This level, again, is only achieved if the lower levels are achieved. The idea behind this is the more foundational a need is, the more desperate the need is to be fulfilled. And we have our situations where different products or services fall at different levels of the needs, and so the appeals and the messages that you use must match the need category that they fall into. This is an example of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as applied to some relevant product categories as well as example marketing slogans that are used. At the physiological level, you'll notice it has things like medicine staples, generic items. And then as it moves up to the safety, you'll see insurance, alarm systems, retirement investments, and things like that that are designed to shelter someone financially. On the belongingness level, we have clothing, grooming products, things of that nature, clubs, drinks, and Pepsi, you're the Pepsi generation is the slogan that's used there. Under ego needs, these include categories such as cars, furniture, credit cards, country clubs, liquors, things that are not necessary for life, but they do fulfill the ego needs. And then finally, self-actualization, the self-fulfillment and enriching experiences. This is where you find travel and education, things of that nature, as well as hobbies. So normally when we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the tourism industry, while sometimes we are talking about physiological needs like finding shelter and things of that nature, the actual act of travel is usually more thought of as a self-actualization need. One of the topics discussed in this chapter is the consumer adoption process and how they adopt innovations. This is also compared to the product life cycle. You'll notice these figures given here. They talk about the different groups, the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and the laggards, and what percentage they are of the total adoption process. This chart to the right shows the 5 different stages with the percentages associated with each one of them, and you can see the curve of the adoption process and where people fall within that curve. In addition to that, you can also see above it the product life cycle. So you can see that the innovators come in very early during research and development in the early stages of the introduction of a product or service. Then you have the early adopters in the introductory stage. The early majority falls mostly in the growth stage. And then as we get to the late majority, usually the service or product has reached its level of maturity and it starts usually in a decline stage when the laggards are coming in. To be part of the consumer adoption model discussed on the previous slide, it's important for the consumer to go through the decision-making model, or the steps in the decision-making process, to determine whether or not they're going to purchase a service or product. The step one is problem recognition, and in this step, nothing really happens unless an individual consumer decides that there's a difference between their desired state, what they would like to see, what they would like to have, versus their current state. And if they see a discrepancy between the two, then there's a recognition that a problem exists, and to rectify that problem, they turn to step two. Step two is the information search. Information search can be a rather simple thing, depending upon the product or service, or it can be very complex. Table 3.1, which is reproduced here, gives you a few of the information source categories and the amount of effort that's required and the credibility that it has with the individual when they're making a decision. So internal information sources like your past experience require very little effort because you already know what they are, and they have a high credibility level with the individual consumer. They're more likely to believe and follow based on their past experiences. External things include personal contacts with individuals, friends and family and so forth. Again, requires low effort and has a very high level of credibility. Marketing efforts such as advertising, promotions, and the work of sales staff requires a great deal of effort, lots of time and resources involved, and has low credibility with the individuals because it's assumed that as persuasive communications, it's not objective. And then finally, public information, so consumer information that's provided, ratings, systems, and internet access to information. It does require a little bit of effort to get a hold of this. It's not low like the internal or personal friend network, but the credibility with this is very high. Step 3 of the consumer decision-making model is the evaluation of the alternatives that come up while you're doing your research. Important in this is the term evoked set. The evoked set is a set of brands that will be considered in the final purchase decision, and it's important if you are marketing a particular service, tourism operation, and so forth, that you want to make sure that you are at least part of the evoked set, otherwise you have no chance of being in the final decision process. Step 4 then is the purchase decision that's made, and a lot of people think that at this point the consumer decision process is complete. But particularly important in this is step 5, the post-purchase evaluation. It's at this stage where an individual consumer decides whether or not the decision that they've made was a good decision. Important in this is the concept of cognitive dissonance. It's the belief that consumers may have second thoughts about the decision that they made, or negative feelings after a purchase has been made. So it's important for organizations to reinforce with those consumers that they have made an excellent choice. The consumer decision-making model, which was just discussed, notes that it starts with a problem recognition, and then the collection of information and research, and then finally the third step is the evaluation of those alternatives. But exactly how are these evaluations conducted? Well, the consumer problem-solving process says that there are two different general categories to do this. One is compensatory, and the compensatory, consumers use the product strengths in one area as to compensate for deficiencies in another area. So while they may not think that a particular airline is strong in terms of their food selection on flights, for example, they do know that they offer flights at times that work particularly well for you. So they compensate for the poor food selection with the great flight times. The other approach is non-compensatory, and this is the conjunctive, where you exceed all the minimums on all the attributes. The disjunctive, exceed minimum at least on one of the attributes, and lexicographic, prioritize and consider one attribute at a time. So you go through starting with your priority list, the most important, second most important, third, and so forth. And as you go down the list, you determine, based on the alternatives, which one gives you the best choice. Not all decisions made by consumers involve a great deal of time or effort. The consumer problem-solving techniques divides the response of consumers into three different categories. They have routine responses, limited problem solving, and then extended problem solving. The routine response behavior is primarily based on habitual response. You generally do the same things over and over again. They require very little search or very little evaluation on your part. For example, if you use the same travel search engines looking for flights, you may just go back to that one, not researching others because you just know you generally get great service there. Others will tend to pick flights from the same airline because past experience has shown them that airline serves them very well, and therefore they just habitually go back to the same airline. The second area is a limited problem solving, and this may involve some search and some evaluation, but again, it's primarily rooted in the experience of the individuals. So just to guarantee that you're making the best decision possible, you may do some additional search and evaluation. You may, for example, always want to go with one airline, let's say United, and you decide that just you're going to check on what the flights are with Southwest or some of the other flights to guarantee that what you had decided earlier was the right way to go. And then finally, the third is extended problem solving. And this involves extensive search and evaluation. It usually involves a situation where you don't have a great deal of past experience. You have a limited habit to fall back on. Therefore, you have to search to find out information for the specific case to make sure that you're making the best decision. Table 3.3, which is reproduced here, identifies 7 different characteristics and problem-solving techniques and then shows you how much is required of each of these 7 characteristics for the routine response, limited problem-solving, and extended problem-solving. As you can see, the amount of search increases from a very minimal to from routine response behavior all the way up to a substantial amount of search being done with the extended problem solving. And if you look further down, you'll note with routine response, which is the more habitual one, we generally look at one brand, the number of attributes evaluated, the things that are important to the decision-making process is just 1 or 2, whereas if you move up to the extended problem solving, we may be looking at a variety of different attributes and looking at a variety of different brands. The number of external information sources used also varies. You have a high number of sources being used with extended problem solving and often no external sources being used with routine response behaviors or habitual behaviors. So the total amount of effort goes in the same direction. Generally very low for routine responses, more or medium amount for limited problem solving, and then a very high amount of total effort being devoted towards extended problem solving decisions. The final topic I'll be talking about in this video is the FCB grid. This is a grid that classifies all types of products based on 2 different dimensions. The first one is involvement, and the second is on how the purchase decision is made. This is based on the individual, how involved is the decision-making process, and then secondly, how do they make the decision. By crossing those 2 different dimensions, you come up with 4 quadrants, which I'll show you in a minute, are informative, affective, habit forming, and then promoting self-satisfaction. Here is an example of the FCB grid, also known as the foot, cone, and Belding grid. And this grid shows you the 4 different dimensions: the informative, also called the thinker, the second, the affective, third, habit formation, and 4, self-satisfaction. And you can see by the one dimension of whether or not it is a thinking decision versus a feeling decision, and then the level of involvement, low versus high, we can divide the categories into one of these quadrants. Placing them in a quadrant helps you to identify what types of strategies you need to convince consumers. Here is an example of an FCB grid that shows you some of the types of products that you would see and services that you would see, and it also gives you some information on the types of appeals one would generally use. So for example, in the high involvement thinking category, very rational decision, this usually involves very expensive items that involve a good deal of decision making. So the information approach is very important here. You have to provide detailed information on the product. You have to use 2-sided arguments so that you are presenting not only the strengths and the weaknesses, but of course highlighting the strengths of making that particular purchase. Also involved in the high involvement category, but the feeling side or the emotional side, are appearance related products, so jewelry, cosmetics, fashion goods, and so forth. These things generally involve psychological appeals. They use a lot of heavy imagery. Think about high-end perfumes and so forth, and the types of advertising that you see for those. Down on the bottom on the low involvement categories, you see in the low involvement thinking or the rational, that tends to be very habitual products. These are things that you use for your household, cleaning items, paper goods, so forth. It's pretty much a one-sided argument. You're trying to convince people to develop a habit to purchase your particular product, and then once they are, you're trying to reinforce that and keep them as your customers. And then finally, on the lower right, you'll see the feeling category, low involvement decisions. These are the self-satisfaction. This category is referred to by some people as life's little gifts, little things we do to help us get through the day. So these are things that are not required but help make life a little easier. So if you don't generally eat junk food from a fast food restaurant, but you've had a really rough day and it sounds really good, that might be one little thing you do to help make your day a little bit better. Thank you today for joining me for this video. It's very important that you review all of the material in the chapter. For example, there's a major section at the end that talks about organizational buying that we haven't discussed here, and there are a variety of other topics that are discussed in the chapter. So read the material carefully, make sure that you're taking those self-assessment quizzes and that you're using the study guides to prepare for them so that you are ready to go when it comes to test time.